Okay, so now we're familiar with circles and their equations, but what if I'm given an equation that's not in the form that I'm used to looking at? What if it's not in center radius form? How can we get it into that form so that we can determine what its center and its radius are? And the answer to that question is that we're going to use some algebraic manipulations on it in order to put it in center radius form so that we can determine the center and the radius. So notice in example 1, they've given us the equation of a circle, but it's not quite used to or quite like what we're used to looking at. It still wants us to find the coordinates of the center and the length of the radius. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by grouping all of the terms that have an x together on the left side. So I'm going to group my x squared and my minus 10x together. And the next terms I'm going to write are my y terms. And then anybody that doesn't have an x or a y attached to it, I'm going to use addition and subtraction to move to the other side. So I'm going to undo this add 10 by subtracting 10 from both sides, making the term on the right side of my equation a negative 10. And then you're familiar with completing the square from your algebra class. That's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to complete the square with the x terms. So x squared subtract 10x plus some mystery number plus y squared subtract 2y plus another mystery number equals the negative 10 plus the number we added in the purple blank to the left side plus the number we're going to add to the green blank on the left side. Remember, we can add or subtract whatever we'd like from an equation as long as we remember to do the same thing to both sides. So the question really becomes now, what number is going to go in each one of those blanks? That's what we need to determine. This is a pretty easy process. It's going to feel a little uncomfortable in the beginning, but you'll get used to it. What we're going to do is we're going to take half the coefficient of x, so half of the negative 10, which is negative 5. We're going to square it, so when I do negative 5 times negative 5, it becomes 25, and that's the number that I'm going to add to both sides. Once I take care of the x's, I'm going to do the same thing for the y's. I'm going to take half of the coefficient of y, so in this case negative 1. I'm going to square it. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1, and I'm going to add it to both sides. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor all the terms, or the first 3 terms. So when I factor the expression x squared minus 10x plus 25, that'll factor into x minus 5 times x minus 5. When I take and factor the next 3 terms, I end up with y subtract 1 times y subtract 1. And lastly, when I combine everything that's on the right side of my equation, I end up with 16. Notice that as I did the factor, my number that went in the parentheses for the purple was this half of the negative 10 number that I squared to get to 25. The number that went in the parentheses for the green y variable was this half of the negative 2 that I squared to both sides. So that might be a little helpful hint as you're going through the factoring on this. So x minus 5 times x minus 5, that's the same as x minus 5, the whole quantity squared. Y minus 1 times y minus 1 is another name for y minus 1, the whole quantity squared, equals 16. So now the center of this circle has coordinates 5, 1. Remember, the square of the radius is 16, making the length of the radius 4. Once you get used to it, the process is pretty straightforward, but sometimes getting used to it can take a little bit of effort. So let's go ahead and jump into another one, and we'll practice this new skill that we're beginning to acquire here. Remember that in order to begin, I'm going to take all the x terms and group them together. And if you want to put your plus blank in there at this point, you can do that because we know that we're going to be adding some mystery number to both sides. Do the same thing for the y terms. And again, it's going to be plus some mystery number. And everything else, we're going to move through addition and subtraction to the other side. So to undo adding a 4, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, making that a negative 4 on the right side of my equation. The mystery number we're going to acquire by taking half of the coefficient of x, negative 2, Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. Add it to both sides. When I take care of the y's, half of positive 6 is positive 3. Square it, add it to both sides. And now I've got to go ahead and do my factoring. So remember that the number that I squared here was a negative 2, and that'll help me with my factoring. This is going to be x minus 2 times x minus 2. The number that I squared for the y terms here was a positive 3, making each of these binomials y plus 3. And on the right side, I'm going to end up with 9, which means my equation here is x minus 2 quantity squared plus y plus 3 quantity squared equals 9. So the coordinates of our center here are 2, negative 3. Remember that the square of the radius is 9, making the length of the radius 3. All right, this should be starting to feel a little bit more comfortable. If it's not and you need more practice, remember that you can always stop, rewind, and replay the video. Let's go ahead now and move on to our last example here. Find the center and the radius of this circle. Notice that this is a little bit different in that the x squared and the y squared both have a coefficient here of 4. So before we can get started completing the square here, what I'm going to do is go ahead and divide each and every term in the entire equation by 4, just to make things as simple and as easy to work with as I possibly can. So I end up with x squared plus y squared plus 6y minus 8y plus 20 equals 0. And now I can get down to work. I've got x squared. Oh, this should be a 6x. I do need to go back and fix that. 6x. X squared plus 6x plus some mystery number. My y's are y squared, subtract 8y, plus some mystery number, equals, and now I have to subtract this 20 from both sides, giving me negative 20 on the right side. And again, I have to add those same two mystery numbers to the right side as I did to the left side. So on my left side here, half of 6 is 3. Square it, you get 9. That's the number you want to add to both sides. For the y values, half of negative 8 is negative 4. Square it, you get 16. That's the number that you want to add to both sides. Now I can go do my factoring here. This is going to be x plus 3 times x plus 3. Or in other words, x plus 3 quantity squared. For the y's, it'll end up being y minus 4 times y minus 4. Or in other words, y minus 4 quantity squared. And on the right-hand side here, I end up with 5. Making the coordinates of the center of the circle negative 3, 4. And since 5 is the square of the radius here is going to be square root of 5. This process is pretty nifty in that once you get the hang of it, it's going to be the same thing over and over and over. So again, once you get comfortable with it, once it starts to feel good, you're going to fly through these problems pretty quickly. As always, I do want you to take some time to think, to reflect, to say to yourself, hey, what's going to be important for me to recall from this video here? What might I need to know for a quiz or a test? And then again, as always, see if you can apply what you've learned to answer the questions on the following page.